Hello and welcome to Mythmakers, the podcast for fantasy fans and fantasy creatives, brought to you by the Oxford Centre for Fantasy. My name is Julia Golding. I'm an author, but also I'm a director of the centre. And today I'm delighted to be joined by one of our graduate students, shall we say. Stanley here has just completed the 6-week online fantasy course. And during that course, it transpired that Stanley is a semi-retired minister, Stanley Hanna, from the Presbyterian Church in Aylmer, Quebec, in Canada. I hope I'm getting that right, Stanley.
Yes.
And at some point, it came out when we were chatting that he has taught a course on Tolkien to theology students. And I thought this was a really interesting take on Tolkien and invited Stanley to come and talk to us. You taught that at the Ottawa School of Theology and Spirituality, if I've got that right.
Yes. Yes. It was an online course. It was all on Zoom. There were about 32 students each week. And it was a 5-week course, 2 hours.
And that's really fascinating that theology students can find enough to say, and there's probably even more to say about Tolkien to cover that course. But before we talk about the sort of subject matter you were covering there, perhaps we should row back a bit and find out about your own journey with Tolkien through your life and how you came to end up teaching him.
My first exposure to J.R.R. Tolkien was actually when I was in graduate school. I had completed 2 years, and I needed to take an internship someplace, and so I set that all up, and I arrived there, and of course, all of a sudden, I was out from under this required hundreds of pages of collateral reading for my courses. And so I decided to take advantage of that time and do some reading for myself. And a friend had recommended The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings. And so this was in the late 70s. And so I picked those up and I started reading them. And I read right through The Hobbit and then right straight through the Lord of the Rings. And then after that, I got interrupted by heading back to graduate school to finish my program. And then after that was when I started studying the Silmarillion and exposed to other of Tolkien's writings, as well as C.S. Lewis and some of these other some of the other inklings. But Tolkien held a particular fascination for me, and I focused primarily on him in my readings, and enjoyed it very much. It was great.
So, Stanley, when you were reading him in the late 70s, I would imagine, particularly if you start with The Hobbit, you're coming to him just as a storyteller at that stage. At what
Yes.
point did you begin to think about the other meanings that might apply to your own profession as a minister? You were explaining to me before we started this chat that you've been involved in lots of different churches in the Protestant tradition. So you represent quite a wide spectrum for Christianity. So perhaps we just run through where you've been a minister over your life.
Well, I'm ordained with the Methodist Church, and I've been ordained for 41 years. But I've also had opportunity to serve in various capacities as minister of visitation, pastoral care, and that in the Anglican Church in Canada, also with the United Church of Canada. And also, most recently, I've been helping with a congregation in Aylmer, Quebec, with the Presbyterian Church. And
Okay,
but prior to that, I
that
was with the Methodists. Yep.
so that's quite a journey through very sort of sister churches, really, aren't they? They're quite close in
Yes.
theological position. Um, So going back to the younger Stanley, reading Tolkien, was it like a dimmer switch coming on where you realized that there was an application, or is it something that came rather suddenly to you?
I think the thing that grabbed me, um, and helped me. I grew up in a very rural, isolated community in southern Ontario, in Canada, and with all of its provincialisms and kind of narrow kind of perspective. And what Tolkien did for me was expand my perspective on, first of all, who God is, and on the whole concept of good and versus evil. And suddenly my world through Tolkien just got so much bigger. And uh, and and it's continued to grow. Um, I've appreciated that probably more than anything else. Is that kind of gave me this leap forward, if you will, in my perspective and my understanding of not only Tolkien's cosmos but also ours, and and it shed light on things and gave me some interesting insights into things that I'd speculated about and thought about while I was growing up. But suddenly I was finding some answers in Tolkien's writings that helped me understand even uh, the the bigger concept of God and his creation. Um, so that was a jump start, if you will, for me.
Yeah, one of the things I say when I do school visits about creative writing is that one way of thinking about fantasy is it's like a laboratory. So you take things from our world and run the experiment in the
Hmm.
world you've created. And so you can run the experiment of what does evil look like, what does courage look like, and all these other things within a creative world in a way that is in a sense purer and you're able to systematize it
Hmm.
in fan, which perhaps gets lost amongst the signals in the real world. So Stanley, let's have an actual think about some of the specifics. You mentioned there your understanding of the nature of evil um, and good was expanded by your thinking about Tolkien. Is this something that you taught on your course in Ottawa?
Yes, the title of the course was J.R.R. Tolkien and his concept of good and evil, and so we got to take a look at the bigger perspective. His particularly the Silmarillion speaks so much to the development of these things, and these concepts, and uh, the thing is that I believe that Tolkien's writing is so deep, and continues to be mined, if you will, by authors in each generation. Just since I started studying in preparation for teaching that course, I was running across all kinds of new books of authors who were putting out all this material. And I think of Harvey's the Song of Middle Earth, and the Hobbit Wardrobe and Great War by LeConte, and these various authors, um, who the Tolkien and the Invention of Myth, that great book that is a whole group of scholars have delved and gone deep into what Tolkien represents. And I think his enduring legacy in his writing is that he plumbed the depth of humanity, um, through and but did so through his own faith perspective, and he was grounded. Um, and the reason that his work, at least that's what I feel I'm discovering, is that the reason his work continues to appeal to generation after generation is this grounding and the touchstones of the virtues and all of those things that we all are looking for and need in our lives, and are hoping to discover and embrace for ourselves.
I was thinking particularly about the nature of evil in Tolkien, because one way there's been a sort of poor copy of Tolkien is the idea of there being a Dark Lord. That's become a bit of a cliche.
Mm-hmm.
Terry Pratchett has fun with that, saying he thinks Dark Lords should be rationed in the world of fantasy.
Yeah.
But of course, that isn't really where the evil resides. Though by Lord of the Rings, it's an eye at the top of a tower. That's only the pinnacle of, literally the pinnacle of the evil. It's appeared in many different forms in many different places throughout Silmarillion and in the characters Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit. So did you find that you were discovering more about how evil functions by following that path through the Silmarillion to the culmination in Lord of the Rings?
I think it broadened my perspective on we the thing that I think that was most important to me was the fact that Tolkien does not avoid evil, nor does he negate it, nor does he ignore it. Instead, he hits it head on. Each of his characters are faced with the challenges that this evil brings. Each of them suffer. Each one of them are have their faults, and in some ways their exposure to the evil even kind of puts a lens on that, enhances it. But then but he doesn't leave it there. Tolkien continues to move through it, in that we face the evil, we face it with each of these characters, and at some point, each of them they exhibit hope and also, I think, redemption. They, in the spite of their failures, in the spite of the fact that they're all flawed, they still um, work through and hit it head on. And it's kind of like Scott Peck's "The Road Less Traveled," in which he talks about the neuroses, which is the great uh, ailment of the Western society, in that we have neuroses of the avoidance of reality. And so here we have each of these characters facing their reality, facing the challenge that is before them. They have to work through this, and they emerge stronger on the other side. Evil isn't done away with, but it is conquered through all of these virtues of faith and love and help and friendship. All of these things conspire to overcome the evil that is present, that wants to pull apart and destroy and all of those kinds of things. So that has helped me understand in a greater way, and be able to give me a much larger picture of what evil is and in our world, and the parallels between J.R.R. Tolkien's Middle Earth and our society today.
It is interesting that actually every character is a failure. Not
Yes.
a failure as a character, but they all fail. They have a
Mm-hmm.
moment of failure.
Yeah.
All of them.
Mm-hmm.
So even someone who's as admirable as anybody can imagine, being Sam, he still has his moment when um he leaves Frodo lying there.
Yep.
Failure is perhaps quite a strong way of putting it. It's a terrible choice he has to make, but he
Mm-hmm.
makes the wrong choice. So he's probably the most perfect and pure of heart of all the characters, really, isn't
Mm-hmm.
he?
Yes.
In the lineup,
Yeah.
because even someone like Galadriel has had a shady past way
Yeah.
back in the beginning of the Silmarillion. We're never quite sure what she did when they crossed the ice and all that. I think the
Mm-hmm.
jury but clearly she's had a past, even though she's ended up in a good place.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I wanted to sort of think about this theme that's intertwined with evil, which is temptation, because it's a very strong theme in the books of C.S. Lewis, who obviously is the other big inkling, writing alongside Tolkien. I'm thinking particularly of that archetypal image of the Turkish delight in
Mm-hmm.
The Lion and the Wardrobe. And also he talks about it in the Screwtape Letters, about, you know, which is his humorous letters between a senior and a junior devil, which again is another quite funny but very insightful portrait of humanity.
Mm-hmm.
Temptation is a huge theme too, running through the Lord of the Rings. Everybody gets their moment when they have to, well, all the main characters get their moment when they have to choose, and that's what sets them apart. Do you think that temptation is, in a sense, something which every single character has to deal with, even the sort of Valar and the god type elements in Lord of the Rings, or is there anybody who's aside from that trial?
I think from what I've read, I think all of them have to deal with the temptation. Each one of them are confronted with the desire of the ring, and of course, it has a power of its own that seems to work on them. And the only one, of course, it doesn't affect is Tom Bombadil, but he's kind of
Oh
a
yes, of course.
strange uh, character anyway. But uh, Bilbo, you know, was, you know, grabbed the ring, you know, found it, but then he immediately kind of dissembles in that he always talks about the fact that he you know, he found it, or and of course he did, but he kind of gives a different picture of how it came into his possession. And each one of them have the temptation. Even they try to give it away, or they try to give it to Gandalf, to, you know, Galadriel. All of them, they all have to face that incredible moment where they have to choose. Um, and it's a forced moment, but Tolkien deals with that so wonderfully, in that they have to reach down within themselves and say, no, I'm not going to be tempted with that. Boromir probably is the one who we see really succumbs and is overwhelmed by it, and that he, you know, continues to, you know, want it until finally all of a sudden the moment comes when he realizes that he's done something very, very wrong. And then he's, you know, in his dying moment, he's given that moment of redemption. um,
Mm.
Aragorn, you know, restores his position, and reflects on him as his king, and, you know, and promises him a proper burial. And um, and in Tolkien's world, that is the redemption. They still have to suffer the consequences of their actions, but um, they they are redeemed through, you know, their attitude and what they had uh, you know, accomplished by
Yeah,
refusing to be overcome.
I think thinking about it in terms of from a creative writing perspective, I think temptation's a really interesting way of making otherworldly characters relatable, because
Yep. Hmm.
um, Tom Bombadil isn't relatable because of his spirit of nature, pan, above everything,
Hmm.
stature. But the moment when we can relate to someone as elegant and queenly as Galadriel is the moment when she has to face her desires and her thirsts. It makes her sort of human. And the
Hmm.
same goes with the
Hmm.
gods, because the gods in the Silmarillion also at times have moments of temptation to interfere or not interfere, that's when they come closest. They still remain fairly distant, but that's the moment when they become closest. So I think temptation's a really important thing to remember when creating characters as a writer, that is when the reader actually can empathize even with the most unlikely of beings, be it an elf queen or an ent. Of course, I don't think Treebeard he doesn't come across the ring. It'd be interesting to know what his response would have been. I've got a feeling he may have been tempted to take it to set the world to rights.
Yeah.
So maybe he would have also had to struggle, though he would have overcome it as well, I think.
Yeah.
Okay, so one of the notable things, of course, having talked about the sort of the values and the ethics in Lord of the Rings, is that it is a world that has no observable religious practices. There is some religion in Numenor. There's a sort of a place which is dedicated to the Valar, and of course there is in the Elven world the mountains where they dwell among them. So there's a sense of the gods walking amongst the elves. Oh, they're kind of like archangel type gods, aren't they? But it is very interesting to choose to put the Christian story outside the narrative, whereas Tolkien himself saw it as a Christian work. That's one of the things he says about it. It's a Catholic story, which contrasts, of course, to C.S. Lewis, who puts all of that in his world. Did you have any thoughts about why, if that works, and what would you be able to have Middle Earth with the Christian element of the story, a sort of Jesus figure in there? How do you think that would work? I mean, it's one of the things I just sort of speculate about, if it would have actually stood up as a story.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I'm not sure it would work the same because you would have to define it in a way that right now, the way it stands, all of the things that were important to J.R.R. Tolkien in understanding humanity and the development of the cosmos and the coming together of those things, and how we relate to one another, and those virtues, how good faces evil, and all of those things. I mean, there's so much that's Christian about those things, but it tends to be a little more nebulous. And I think if you defined it, you would probably, from my perspective, I think you would diminish what was taking place amongst the company, with Gandalf, and the interaction with the elves, the learning to work together to accomplish the big thing. I don't know if it would have it would have certainly brought a different flavor to it, and I'm not sure it would have had as much appeal. I think there's
it certainly, it would have closed it down. It would have certainly put off people coming at it, the shared space, which is Tolkien, which is what I really love about it, that you can come at it from all faiths and no faith, because it's a welcome space. I suppose, looking at it though, maybe there is a sense of Tolkien's understanding of Christ is fractured in many different places. So you get a glimpse of it in Gandalf, you get a glimpse of it in the sort of scapegoat figure of Frodo carrying the burden for everybody else. You can trace it, but it's not located in one figure, not an Aslan. And also, of course, Tolkien hated allegory, so he would have not enjoyed putting an allegorical Christ in his world, I don't think.
Yeah,
but
that's right.
The other option is he thought of it as like an Old Testament world. When I've done books where I've put a sort of world religion in it, I've always thought of it like that I imagine this in some way as prior, a sort of prior history, and it frees you up to not have to do Islamic or a Christian or whatever your background is story. Yeah. So Stanley,
it's kind of infused throughout this this perspective that he had, and it's infused in the writing, but it's not blatant. And when you uncover it, it's one of those aha moments rather than oh, that's what I was looking for kind of thing, or that's what I was expecting to find. It just suddenly appears, and to me, that is probably one of the greater and long-term appeals, and why again this work continues to be mined generation after generation. They come at it and saying, there's so much here. I'm not sure Tolkien himself meant to, for all of these commentaries and everything else to be written on his work, and yet the depth of it is there, I believe, because he was writing from a place of deep faith and consideration, and how he viewed his own faith in his world and how that interacted, and so that's become infused in the work itself.
Yes, I think it's that feeling that it doesn't tarnish, it doesn't wear away because it goes all the way through everything. It's not a sort of cheaply built, quick built world. It's you don't reach the end of the map there, do you? It's always expanding, feeling that it's got the fullness of our own world in there. And of course, he wanted to be a creator, and he achieved that brilliantly. It's an inspiration and something which I think very few people can achieve. So we always end our podcast with deciding where in all the fantasy world is the best place to go for something. We've done forests and museums and libraries and all sorts of things before. And I thought, in your honor, Stanley, if you don't mind, we would think about where is the best place to be a priest or a religious leader. And I think we should also add in at this time, where's the worst place? Because I actually found it easier to think of all the terrible places to be a religious leader rather than good ones. Because I think fantasy writers often use religion as a kind of, the wicked principle in their worlds. So did you have a thought where would be the best place to be a priest?
Well, I think probably Narnia, because you've got the presence of Aslan, and that there would be a sense of the presence of Aslan in there, and you'd be working with an understanding that this world is infused with that wonder and grace and awe and beauty, and that I think that's my initial response. I've read a lot pretty widely in fantasy literature, and I like all of the all of these different worlds I've encountered. But I think in answering your question, it would seem to me that Narnia would be the place to land, doing the kind of work that I do, and yeah.
That's the one I picked out as well. Partly because, of course, if you're somehow in the leadership team with Aslan, if he had such a thing, you could get to be something else, like you get to be a minotaur or a faun. That'd be fun. To actually experience life as another creature or a talking badger. So I think that's a good way to go. So what about the worst place to be a religious leader?
Westeros. Game of Thrones.
short life expectancy. I thought of a couple. I thought of they're all pretty bad in Philip Pullman's Dark Materials world. I don't want to be any of those, because not only are you a bad guy, but you also get a really rubbish daemon. You get like a cockroach or I don't know, something like that. So
Yep.
that seems pretty miserable.
Yeah.
And then the other one is Trudy Canavan's Age of 5 series starts with the Priestess of the White. And I remember reading that thinking this is a really rubbish place to be a god,
Yeah.
because they sort of have to experience almost terrible things. So it's definitely an adult book. So I think it's up there with Westeros as a rubbish experience. Anyway, Stanley, thank you so much for being with us. And it sounds like you've got more courses. You've done good and evil, but there's lots more Tolkien theme that you could do for your School of Theology and Spirituality. So good luck with future teaching on that. And thank you so much for being with us today. Thank you.
It's a real pleasure. Thank you, Julia.